So we're here today at the Great Barrier Reef Forum to discuss the future of this magnificent phenomenon. This is on the eve of the culmination of what many believe is the most progressive international agreement for action on climate change in Paris. Although the current commitments are only to keep the world's temperature perhaps below 2.7 degree rise, which is perhaps not low enough to avoid catastrophic impacts. My name is Professor Richard Kingsford. I'm the President of the Society for Conservation Biology, and we have with us a wonderful panel made up of Sean Houben, who's the Freshwater Policy Manager for Worldwide Fund for Nature, and well-versed with the challenges and solutions of the Great Barrier Reef. Terry Hughes is Distinguished Professor from James Cook University and Director of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies. He's been at the forefront of the science diagnosing the causes of reef decline and also suggesting policy and management solutions. And Carol Sweatman is the CEO of Terrain, at the coalface, if you like, of the Natural Resource Management Group in the wet tropics, driving solutions with farmers to improve the water quality flowing to the Great Barrier Reef. Starting with Carol, and I'll ask each one of the panel members to tell us briefly why they care about what happens to the Great Barrier Reef. Carol.
Thanks, Richard. I guess I care for two really important reasons, and one of them is that I live in the catchment of the Great Barrier Reef, and I was going to ask a question of the audience, just is there anybody else here tonight who lives in the catchments of the Great Barrier Reef? Fantastic, that's excellent, because it does make a difference. And you know, a lot of the time that we're talking about the Great Barrier Reef, it's always from a building in Brisbane or Canberra or somewhere like that, and it's really important to remember that the Great Barrier Reef catchment is made up of communities, and it isn't all about the science and policy, and obviously that's critical and that's what makes the decisions and so forth. But the reason I'm here is because I work directly with the communities that live in the catchment and the ones that are pretty much charged with the ultimate responsibility of making the changes that we want to see around water quality, although we're all charged with the responsibility about the larger challenges to do with obviously climate change and some of the other impacts outside the catchment itself. So that's why I'm here on behalf of our communities, if I can say that.
Sean?
I work on the Great Barrier Reef sort of accidentally. My background's in freshwater. I worked with Richard on a few issues to do with the Murray-Darling Basin. So I sort of stumbled across this mainly because freshwater is one of the key impacts on the Great Barrier Reef. The pollution coming down onto the reef, which can smother, the ecosystem, but also lead to crown of thorns outbreaks. But the question in a way is strange because so many people care about the Great Barrier Reef, and I think that's probably why I enjoy working on the campaign so much, because for so many environment issues, to get cut through, to get people engaged is so hard. But for the Great Barrier Reef, it's great to work on because people love it so much and they get behind you and they support you. So I suppose that's part of the reason I've worked on and have continued to work on the Great Barrier Reef.
Terry?
Well, there's lots of reasons why you would value the Great Barrier Reef. From an economic and social standpoint, the reef is a huge contributor to Queensland's economy. It supports a huge tourism industry and fishing industry that are together worth about $6 billion a year. From a personal perspective, I moved to Australia in 1990. I was a marine biologist studying coral reefs in the Caribbean, and just the opportunity to come and study the largest and most interesting coral reef in the world was something I couldn't turn down.
Fabulous. So I guess, Terry, just to start us off on the discussion, can you perhaps outline what the science is telling us are the key threats affecting the reef?
Sure. Well, it's a fairly familiar story, I'm afraid, for coral reefs all around the world. There are three biggies that affect reefs. One is overfishing. In Australia, the extent of fishing pressure is relatively modest compared to many small, poorer countries in the Pacific or in the Caribbean. A second threat to reefs is pollution, mostly pollution coming from land. And for a continent like Australia, where we have big rivers, that is a very important issue for the barrier reef. And the third big threat to reefs globally is climate change. And climate change affects reefs everywhere. There's nowhere to hide if the hot water shows up. So even pristine reefs that are in the middle of the Pacific are impacted by climate change. So an interesting backdrop for this discussion, you mentioned COP21 in Paris. The science community is very concerned about the prospect of a bleaching event occurring towards the end of the current El Nino cycle. So as I'm sure everyone in the audience is aware, Queensland is mostly in drought at the moment. Reefs in the Pacific, in Hawaii in particular, are bleaching at the moment because we're in the middle of a very strong El Nino event that is forecast with a quite high probability at this stage to cause bleaching all around Australia, obviously in the tropics, but on the Barrier Reef, on Ningaloo Reef, on Scott Reef in Western Australia, probably around March. Now, we've been here before where NOAA and BOM have made those kinds of forecasts.
That's a Bureau of Meteorology and...
That's correct.
Yeah,
That's right. Yeah. So that both the Australians and the Americans, and those forecasts don't necessarily come to pass. It's like any long-range forecast, it can be wrong. And in particular, if we got a strong cyclone in February, it would probably stir things up enough that we won't see a mass bleaching event.
Carol, I guess you've got your finger on the pulse of the community in the north. How much is there acceptance of the science that Terry's telling us about the causes and problems?
I think it's probably fair to say that that's mixed, and that I guess one of our challenges is it's not necessarily about the real acceptance of the science, but better communication around it, telling the story so people can get a handle on what it really means for them individually, or the possible impacts that they're making, or how their own community interacts with the reef. So I guess short answer is it's mixed, like a lot of big global issues around science, and climate is another one of those. But I think that part of our challenge is that it is a complex story to tell, and that people often really want to see the science in their own backyard, and something that's visible and obvious to them to help it make it easier to understand the connections between what happens on the coast and what happens on the reef. So we tend to focus on trying to tell that story in a way that makes sense locally, and then talk about the positive nature of things that people can do to make a difference to those outcomes. So it's not something that we focus on 100%, but it is part of telling the story overall.
Do you find there's a difference in the communities depending on where they live close to the reef or up in the catchment?
No, I think it varies generally. I suspect that my general experience would be that if you tend to be in the spotlight and potentially being blamed, I guess, for some of the challenges, then that maybe puts you in a position of being more defensive around the science the further away you are in Southeast Australia or another part of the country. Maybe it's a lot easier for you to come to grips with that because it's something that's happening outside your direct area of impact. So I guess that's part of our challenge. If you feel like you're under the spotlight, it makes it a lot harder for you to work in that space, and I think that's why we need to think a bit more positively around how we sell that story. I know it's a hard, bad story, and it's not a lot of good news in it. But I think we need to, I guess someone was talking about this the other day, how do we tell the story about what the positive changes can be around the science rather than focusing on the blame and the negative and what's bad around the corner, and think about what's really possible in terms of change. I know that a lot of the changes that have happened in the coastal zone over the last 5 to 8 years that have had a positive impact in the water quality space have all been due to action by people living and working on the coast. So there's a really positive story there, and I think if we can better tell that story and talk about those positive impacts, I think it'll be more helpful.
And I guess, Sean, you have to convince governments, or one of your jobs is to convince governments to take action. Do you get a sense that there's an appetite and understanding of the science at state and federal levels?
I think there is in certain sections and certain ministers. Just sort of flipping off some of Carol's comments, I think the understanding of the science in the broader public is very important. We sometimes, WWF, get accused of being a bit too nerdy. We put reports together, we go and talk to ministers or bureaucrats and have that sort of very internal conversation, which is really important to do to try and solve the problems with them. But at some point, it really does come down to communicating to the public and getting the message out there to the public. It might be a harsh call, but sometimes politicians don't necessarily move unless they see that there is a public support for something, especially when it's hard, when it involves changing the law or changing people's practices in the catchment or big amounts of funding. So I think, working with ministers or staffers or the bureaucracy so they understand it's important, but I think it's equally, if sometimes not more important, to ensure there's a good awareness in the public and the public is asking the government to take action.
And I guess part of that action is Reef 2050 plan. And Terry, you've been quite critical in your writing about some of the port developments in the World Heritage Area. We have some sort of fanfare, I guess, by governments that dredging will no longer happen in the marine park. Is everything under control? Can we be happy that the future is good in terms of regulation of port developments?
How long have we got? That's a complicated issue. So it wasn't actually me personally who raised this issue. It was actually UNESCO who came on the scene a couple of years ago over their concerns about the World Heritage values of the Great Barrier Reef. So the Great Barrier Reef was inscribed as a World Heritage property in 1981. Australia made the case to UNESCO, which is the world body in charge of World Heritage areas, that the Great Barrier Reef was such a special place of amazing biodiversity and geological interest that it should be inscribed as the first marine World Heritage area. And so that bid by Australia was successful. One of the arguments during that inscription was that the Great Barrier Reef was intact. And of course, it's a huge system. The marine park is 344,000 square kilometres. It's about the size of Italy. And the government of the time made the case that it was an interconnected, diverse region that was fully functional and entire over the whole region. UNESCO have become concerned about something called the integrity of the World Heritage Area. In other words, bits of it are being degraded. So if we look at the evidence for instance, the amount of corals that's on the Great Barrier Reef, there's been about a 50% decline over the last 30 years. That decline is very patchy. It's been much higher than 50% on nearshore fringing reefs, particularly south of Cooktown. That patchiness in how the reef is travelling, and you could use other metrics like the amount of fish or sharks that are out there, is quite clear evidence that the integrity of the World Heritage Area is actually being compromised. And UNESCO are concerned about that. So they came to Australia on what's called a site visit in 2013 to go to Curtis Island, where the coal seam gas plants are being built just outside Gladstone Harbour. So they're concerned about port development. In response to considerable pressure from UNESCO, both the Commonwealth and state governments have now legislated for a ban on dumping at sea of capital dredge spoil. So capital dredging is where you first expand a harbour or a passageway. Maintenance dredging is where you keep it clean in subsequent years. So it's still legal to dump maintenance dredging, and some countries who are members of the World Heritage Committee have expressed concerns about that. So the banning of dumping at sea of capital dredge spoil was a huge step forward. So there are some bright spots in making progress.
And what's the impact of dredge spoil?
Well, you have to think about the amount of it. So over the last 10 years or so, close to 40 million cubic meters of dredge spoil has been dredged and then dumped in the World Heritage Area. That volume of sediment is very close to the amount of sediment that flows into the reef from all of the rivers that drain into it. And obviously the 2050 plan is primarily concerned about runoff of sediment and nutrients into the reef. We've close to matched that amount of sediment in the amount of dredge boil dumping that's occurred in the last decade. So the scale is quite huge.
Just going to add a point there. I think the World Heritage Committee process was critical. It had the eyes of the world in Australia on what we were doing, and I think that drove change a lot. And that was a sort of bizarre international bureaucracy process. But back to my previous point, I think it was really important that people got engaged as well. And so we ran a very simple campaign, which was "Don't Dump on the Reef," and I think that got a lot of people engaged. Some of the water quality stuff can be quite complex and hard to understand. Fishing pressure can, but that sort of cut through to a much wider audience. And I think it was a combination of being reviewed by the World Heritage Committee and a groundswell of public, loathing that we were sort of just dumping a whole lot of, sediment on the reef. That it was those two factors, the high level and the public, which drove the change. It was a nice combination.
Yeah. So if I could explain what the 2050 plan is, it's a joint plan between the Commonwealth and the state of Queensland. The plan was requested by UNESCO, and despite the name 2050, it's really being unrolled in stages. So there are now targets for the first 5 years of that plan, but not for the next 5 or the 5 after that. And it's primarily focused on land use, with very ambitious targets to reduce the amount of sediment and runoff from land. There are a couple of problems with the plan. One is there isn't enough money to achieve these very ambitious targets. The main problem I see with the plan, and many scientists would agree with me, is that it dodges the issue of climate change. Climate change and Australia's response to it is the biggest policy failure for the Great Barrier Reef. The Commonwealth Government has said as much in something called the Outlook Report. So the Outlook Reports are produced every 5 years by the Commonwealth. They're written by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, a Commonwealth agency. And the two reports that have been produced so far both identify climate change as the single biggest medium and long-term threat to the Great Barrier Reef. So it really is critical that Australia joins the international community in dealing with climate change. And so far, we're not doing that.
And I guess on that, Sean, the Carmichael mine in the Galilee Basin is, being depicted by critics as one of the well, it is the largest coal mine in Australia, if not the world, and up to 8,000 hectares, going to produce 4.49 billion tonnes of CO2. And I guess it seems a real mismatch that is going clearly to affect the reef, both in terms of transport, but also in terms of climate change.
Sure.
How do you see this mismatch?
Yeah, I think, climate change is the biggest medium and long-term threat to the reef, and it has to be addressed. Our work has focused more on the direct impacts on the Great Barrier Reef, the downstream impacts of mining through dredging and port development. That said, we have a sort of, a big campaign nationally and globally to take action on climate change, and that can be through national action, international action, and it can be looking at mines, and it can be looking at positive solutions such as renewable energy. So I think it's we don't actually work specifically trying to sort of stop mines, project by project. We sort of try and get a sort of more national solution. That said, having a whole lot of coal dug up and burnt in other countries is not going to help, and it certainly isn't part of the solution.
Carol, I guess, it is a grim picture, and, we all know that, but there are some bright spots. And I guess some of the things that have been achieved in water quality, but there are big challenges as well. There are big challenges. Terry mentioned about how much money's needed. There are estimates that, we need $780 million in the next 5 years, and we've really got nothing like that. And then there's talk about, the thresholds might not be high enough in terms of reductions of nitrogen and fine sediment. Perhaps you can explain, you know, given that you're sort of, as I mentioned, at the coalface,
Sure.
how you deal with that and how you effect change essentially.
Sure. I guess being in the wet tropics, we've got all eyes on us. We're at the top of the table that you don't ever want to be at, which is for our small 5% of the whole of the reef catchments, we're the top polluting location in terms of nitrogen specifically. So we've got all the challenges in a very small location, and I guess people ask me, why is that the case? Is it because of a particular industry and so forth? And I keep trying to explain it's actually a combination of factors for us, largely some of them I can't change. So it is highly intensive agriculture on a narrow coastal strip. We do have 9 separate catchments with significant rainfall events, as you can imagine, in the wet tropics, which produce volumes to the reef in multiple amounts compared to other locations across the GBR. We are very close to the coastal reef there, and we tend to have significant cyclonic and other weather events at the same time. So we've got this perfect storm in a way, I guess, of those combined features, of which some we can control, but some things like the capacity, the connectivity to the reef, the amount of rainfall and so forth is beyond our control. So we've got some very high targets. Yes, the 80% reduction in nitrogen getting to the reef from agriculture is a huge challenge in the wet tropics and in some or other locations, but the focus is on us.
So what sort of levels are you at the moment?
So we've made a reduction over the last 8 years in the vicinity, our contribution to the 17% reduction over the whole of the reef. So we predict, with what we know in terms of current practices, that we might get to 30. So of course our big challenge is to say, well, what comes next? And that within the known realm, I can keep working on that. And people say to me often, if you could only invest in one thing, what would it be? And I say, it's the innovation about what comes next. I can work with people now on what we need to do now, but I'm going to get to a cliff edge in 2-3 years, which says I don't know what I actually need next. So our biggest challenge is to focus on that now and make sure that the next interventions, the next practices, the next things we need to do are well and truly in our hands when we need them. And I guess that someone said to me, well, what do you think that even looks like? And I said, well, I think that the challenge for us is that we tend to see the impact on the reef of sediment, nitrogen, pesticides and so forth, but they indicate to me that we've got an underlying resource health issue in the coast generally. You know, we are faced with degrading soil health. We're faced with the general, what I would call, not great management of our waterways and wetlands and coastal systems at all. So while the impact has been very much on the reef, we're faced with this challenge generally in the coast. And with degrading soil health, for example, that's going to have a long-term impact on our agricultural viability. So it's this sense now, I think, that we need to look for what comes next, and we need to invest in that now to understand what that will be. But it will be much more challenging because it will be much greater changes. But also to understand that without repair to that underlying resource that we depend on in terms of our agriculture and our livelihoods, you know, we'll continue to see challenges in the coast. So that's my perspective. It isn't, yes, the reef is the symptom of some of that challenging resource condition, but we need to tackle it head on, not only for the reef, but also for the health of the coast and for our ongoing livelihoods and agriculture as well. So, and I think some of those methods which we're already working on are going to be pretty challenging for people, because it's talking about changes beyond artificial fertilisers, for example, and moving into different systems of agriculture that look at different cycles and different management, and that will take some people. It will take a fair bit of effort for people to get their minds around some of that.
So it's not a question of not understanding all the causes. It's partly a question of money and also a question of how can people change.
Absolutely.
And modernise and,
yes,
in the words of our new Prime Minister, innovate, I guess.
Innovation, yes.
Yeah, I didn't want to keep harping on that, but certainly, well, for example, we've got a network of over 50 farmers in the wet tropics at the moment that are experimenting with 25, 50 and 75% less application of nitrogen rates currently utilised by other farmers. This is pretty exciting stuff and the sorts of things that we will need to see happen in the future. And of course, we all know that takes testing, trialling, validating and taking that to the market for that to be successful across the broader area. But without that, the risk-taking that some of those farmers are already undertaking to trial and test some of those things, then we won't be ready in the years to come when we're really going to need it.
Do you think there's any danger of the markets starting to exert pressure in terms of produce from land that's affecting the Great Barrier Reef?
I don't think that's a risk. I think that's a fantastic opportunity.
Yeah.
And I know that Sean will probably want to talk about that a little bit, but certainly from my perspective, people ask me, well, is it just all about the community on the coast in the GBR? And it's not, because the climate challenge is everybody's responsibility. And I would say that our whole attitude to what we're willing to pay for and accept in terms of stewardship of the land will actually hit everybody's hip pocket, because it is about prices for food and other produce that we expect people to be able to provide to us at a minimum cost. And the reality is, if we're going to look after those underlying resources well into the future, there is a cost associated with that, which is about enabling people to be stewards of the resources that they're utilising. And yes, there absolutely is a cost to that at the moment most of us aren't willing to pay for or acknowledge or accept. So that is a change around the market systems that we absolutely need to think about very, very carefully and consider what that what opportunities that will present us rather than the risk.
Yeah, just on the market stuff, I think many companies are moving that way. We actually take money from Coca-Cola to give to cane farmers to develop innovative new practices which are profitable and cut pollution. And that's a nice project in itself, but the more important stuff is that big companies like Coke have signalled they're only going to buy produce from accredited farms. So it's called bon sucre, French for good sugar. And so there's an international standard saying you need to farm a certain way with certain practices, and then you can be accredited. And I think, generally speaking, again, with the reef, it's such a sort of popular issue. People will want to buy food that is produced in a way which doesn't harm the reef. So I think that sort of market pressure is coming. And the role for the government right now is to help farmers get ready for that, to transition to better practices. The best practice we know has to be taken up by every farmer, and then you can get 30% cuts, which is good. And then we've got to go into the innovation. I think, government and farmers and big business need to work together to solve this problem. And it's something we can solve, but we have to be, I think, quite focused on it and quite realistic about what that will cost. And right now in 2050, there are these ambitious targets to achieve 80% reductions. But the Queensland government is going through a process now to say, what do we need to do and how much will that cost, which is a good exercise. So far, the Australian government isn't doing the same thing. So they've committed to these targets in Reef 2050, but they aren't putting in place the programs nor the funding to actually get there. So I think there needs to be pressure put on them to make that change.
Yeah, I think public support is really critical. We can have all the plans and policies we like, and the scientists can talk behind closed doors to bureaucrats, but that's not going to make any difference if you don't have support from local communities. And that's true on the water just as much as it is on land.
Absolutely.
So one of the success stories in the recent history of the Barrier Reef was the rezoning of the reef in 2004. That rezoning took place because the monitoring programs that were counting the corals and the fish began to show these 10-year-long trajectories that weren't good news. And so the decision was made that the reef needed to be rezoned to ramp up the level of protection. And that was only going to work if local people bought into the process. So the agency involved was GBRMPA, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. They achieved 30,000 written submissions on their draft plan. They ran close to 1,000 public meetings. It was quite controversial. They also did polling, which showed that there was very high level of support for rezoning the reef. And as the outcome of that process was going from 5% no fishing zones to 33% no fishing zones, which we still have today. So that was an incredibly successful program, but it was only successful because it was mostly bottom up. And it wasn't just imposed on people, because that never works.
Can I just add something to that? That I think that part of the challenge at the moment with the focus around the policy and the science, which we're trying to get those settings correct, is that we're assuming that the communities will be what I call the solution takers. Whereas really the only things that are working where community are the solution makers, and that they own the answers to this, and that they're willing, able and happy to actually take up those actions and do the things on the ground. And I'm living and working in the communities in the reef, you know, an absolute believer that that's really where we need to be focusing our effort. And if it only comes from the top, we'll just get resistance to that. We'll get people saying, you know, wanting to not believe the science and other things as a way of not dealing with some of the challenges of this, of a top-down push. And in all my experience, the best solutions come from those people who need to make them happen, you know, and that's really, really critical.
So to some extent, we're talking a little bit about the legacy, and you know, projections are that Queensland agriculture in the north will double by 2040, and populations will double by 2040. That may or may not happen, but how do you manage for that? You know, what's the way to go?
We did a bit of modelling recently which showed that if you did double agriculture in Queensland based on the Queensland government's own maps of suitable agricultural land, you would increase nitrogen pollution by 500%. So we're actually, and that's at best practice. So that scenario probably won't happen because some of that land, even though it's suitable, probably isn't, and the market isn't there. But it's a real risk. Biofuels is another sort of big driver right now, which the government's running on. So if we're trying to achieve cuts of up to 80%, we can't be allowing expansion of agriculture without appropriate controls on. So in that case, the solution probably is regulatory. You've got to say, sure, you can farm, but it'd be better if you farmed in a way which didn't increase pollution. And this goes back to the innovation part. If you farm smarter, if you can use less chemicals and get more crops, so using your current land better rather than just expanding into new land and farming with sort of old high polluting methods. I think that's the challenge for Queensland and probably the rest of the world. We're going to have to, you know, feed a growing population, and we can't just keep expanding. We've got to use our existing land better.
I think also the question is also about area versus value. And I think that you may well look at how you increase the value of your agriculture, and it might be, you know, in how you farm or different crops or whatever. That's something we need to look at. It's not just about doubling size. I think
so do you find that there are some farmers who are lighter in their footprints and still manage to get the economic value?
Absolutely. We've got everybody across the whole spectrum, and I guess that's why I'm always an advocate. There is no one size fits all, because what you need, the farmers who are innovative, the support that they require to continue to improve is very different to those people who are just coming into the space of improving their practices and getting up to best practice. So it is really about understanding where we all sit as individuals, and that's no different to any one of us who is trying to change any of our everyday practices, whether it be around how you work day to day or your impact on climate change or whatever it might be. We all have to deal with these things in our own individual way, and every farm and every enterprise is different. We want to get everybody to a standard that minimises that impact, but everybody's an individual and we need to recognise that.
To my mind, the biggest challenge looking forward is a challenge of governance. So if you look at the history of governance of the Great Barrier Reef, in 1976, the Marine Park was established by the Commonwealth. That was an incredibly visionary thing to do. They basically custom designed a single agency in charge of a piece of real estate the size of Italy, and everyone knew where the buck stopped. It was actually opposed by the state of Queensland at the time, who took the Commonwealth to the High Court but lost. So that was the beginning of the engagement between the state and the Commonwealth, which thankfully is a lot more harmonious today. But generally what's happened through time is that this custom-designed agency, Gabrumpa, has been outgrown. The threats to the reef are no longer internal. It's not just about fishing or tourism pressure or whatever. It's about the CO2 in the atmosphere. It's about coastal development, port development, mines that are 400 kilometres inland. And so the agency structure is no longer optimal for its purpose. And so I see a huge challenge in matching the structure of the governance to the scale of the threats that are impacting the coral reef. And obviously the bigger the scale the threats get, global climate change being the obvious one, the harder it is. But I think until we improve the governance structure for the Great Barrier Reef, we're going to continue to have some of these problems.
So, as you say, there are 4 federal agencies and 6 state agencies with a stake in the Great Barrier Reef, and there are...
How long is a piece of string?
But I guess the other thing I was going to add, Terry, there are 2 scientific panels, one state expert panel and one federal expert panel, and you're a member on both. And I guess the question is, if we are going to get cut through and sort out the governance, what are your suggestions?
Okay, let me try and unpack what you just said. You referred to a whole list of agencies. Australia tried to convince the World Heritage Committee that it's currently spending $2 billion over each decade in protecting the Great Barrier Reef. That figure comes from the operational budget for a whole string of agencies, which includes my centre. We don't actually manage the Great Barrier Reef. The Australian Institute of Marine Science, AMSA, which is the organisation that stops ships from hitting the reef, the Maritime Safety Organisation. It's actually not entirely honest to claim that that $2 billion has been used to protect the reef, and there wasn't any money in making that calculation. So UNESCO have asked Australia to operationalise the 2050 plan and to adequately resource it. At the moment, they're not adequately resourcing it, and they need to report back to UNESCO on that by the end of 2016. The other issue you raised is the governance structure for the plan, which is incredibly cumbersome. There are at least 6 committees with about 80 people on them, and Carol and I are on one of the state-based committees. I'm also on one of the Commonwealth committees, but do you really need 80 people to advise the government on runoff onto the reef? Wouldn't 10 be enough if you pick the right people?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's also about genuine independence. Like there's numerous bodies and advisory councils, but I think it's how you set up that genuine independence. So you have an agency which can report on what is the health of the reef, what is the success of the programs, and what's the outlook. So the outlook report is probably one of the sort of standout, processes which every 5 years says here's the key threats and here's the outlook, and is well respected. You have other things like the Queensland Auditor General brought out a report recently critiquing the Queensland system and the failures there, and one of them was governance, that does so many different agencies and no central authority. Since then, the Queensland government has set up the Office of the Great Barrier Reef, which is a step in the right direction, but I think you need to actually have something like Garumpa, but a much broader sweep, so you don't have numerous federal and numerous state agencies. One of the sort of crazy parts right now is for the water quality situation, you have Queensland programs and federal programs which don't necessarily meet, and they work at cross purposes even though they're trying to achieve the same outcome. So yeah, the system is quite busted even though there's been a fair bit of work put into it.
So are there any solutions in a federal system? I mean, this has always been an issue about who's responsible. Is it a federal responsibility or a state responsibility, or are there parts that should be more a federal responsibility than a state responsibility?
I think one solution, which we suggested previously to the federal government, was to set up a reef bank. They've called it a reef trust, which is trying to get an independent agency which puts together the plan of what the most cost-effective actions are to bring back reef health and to pool all the resources and to spend that. The Australian government took it on, called it Reef Trust, but it was pretty much just a label for the bureaucracy. They didn't actually set up the genuine independence. And so I think if that actually happened, it was an independent agency charged with investing money in the best possible way, which both Queensland, Australian and private funds went to. I think that would be a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree. I think the funding should come from government coffers rather than Mickey Mouse mechanisms that don't really raise enough money. So part of the cash flow, in theory at least, into the Reef Trust is offset money.
Sure.
So, very briefly, there's a whole set of governance issues around how in Australia new developments are assessed and planned. And there's a growing trend for the government to effectively levy developers to charge them an amount of money called an offset, which will allow development to proceed even if it is going to cause serious damage to the environment. And the idea is that by paying money into some sort of a trust fund, there will be a so-called net benefit to the environment. So an example of that is when the Carmichael mine was approved by Minister Hunt for the next 60 years, the developer, Adani Mines, had to pay a $1 million offset to build a new forest for the endangered finch. By the time that forest grows up in 30 years' time, the finch is likely to be locally extinct. So there's a big issue between the time lag of when an offset is actually operationalized, and $1 million over 10 years is a trivial amount of money compared to the environmental damage that $14 billion development will cause. There's also all sorts of conflicts of interest that can easily arise between how that money is spent and who makes that decision. And we have a long way to go in Australia to make that a transparent process.
Yeah, no, just a quick response. I wasn't necessarily referencing offset money. I think there's a whole lot of issues there that have to be dealt with. I was talking about more private sector funds. A lot of the actions for the farming sector, they actually are profitable practices, so they could in theory be done on a loan basis or an investment basis. So you could have super funds or even ethical super funds who have a less of a rate of return on their investments, investing in actions which actually are good for the farmer and good for the reef. So trying to sort of access that kind of private capital rather than the sort of offsets money.
Carol?
I was going to offer a slightly different view on the governance conversation. I think that, yes, we can absolutely get away from the duplication of committees and so forth. It doesn't need all those people, and we constantly feel like we're meeting. It's fairly intense at the moment. But one of the big things that's missing out of that is that the community is not part of that process. They're connected up through organisations like ours, but that's fairly peripheral in a lot of ways to the processes, and we haven't really thought about a true governance system that is actually about bringing that input properly into the conversation about how to get the answers on the ground. And I think that any review of the governance really needs to think about shrinking that big layers, multiple layers of scientists and government policy and so forth sitting there thinking about this, and think about how we broaden that out and make sure that we're getting greater engagement around what the solutions are, because I think that's part of that whole communication about owning the issue as well, is that it's too easy to distance yourself from it when there's this big infrastructure around committees and so forth making those decisions. So I think there's an added element that needs to be on the table around the governance, which is really about bringing those two things much closer together.
So I guess, Carol, on that, do you think the community needs to be much more involved in the funding and the governance? I mean, how do you expect that to work? Is it more a case of collapsing the bureaucratic layers and making the money flow? I mean, there's got to be some accountability issues here as well.
Absolutely. And look, I think there's probably a couple of things I'd like to mention, particularly over the last 8 years. For every dollar the government's been putting on the ground, farmers have been putting $1.60 into improvements in the reef. So that's a pretty significant private sector investment, if you want to categorise it that way, that's already happened in that space. I think that I think what happens when we're in a time of critical concern around things like the reef is there's a tendency to go into a process which is more highly prescriptive, because people are worried about whether the right outcomes will happen. And I think that in doing that, we're losing sight of some of what the bigger outcomes need to be, and working with people to really come up with the solutions around that. So I think, yes, we need to keep our eye on the prize around the targets, But there's multiple solutions to that in multiple locations depending on the circumstances. So let's work with people much more proactively around that and learn as we go along, because things 5 years ago are very different to they are today in terms of our understanding of what's required. 5 years ago, I didn't know what the priorities were out of the 9 catchments in the wet tropics. I've now got a plan that tells me what the top 4 are and what targets I need to meet and how much it's going to cost to do it in each of those locations. So we're in a much more powerful position to readily influence what needs to happen where and how and for what outcome than we were in the past. So let's use that to its maximum benefit and just get on and do it. I think we need to really listen to that information that's already been compiled and endorsed by local communities and make it happen.
Great. Now I'd like to perhaps let questions from the floor for the last 10 minutes or so. So I'm just going to give this microphone. Have we got any questions?
Mark Hockings from University of Queensland. I think the Outlook reports, both of them, when they've come out, have been unusual government reports in that they've been, to my mind at least, pretty brutally honest about the condition and the future prospects for the reef. I think it's amazing that the government brought them out in that way. You've been making a case tonight that we really need to see a step change in the way in which we seek to manage the reef in terms of policy, in terms of the funding, the resourcing that we put into that. And yet it seems to me that what we're still seeing in terms of response is essentially incremental. And I wonder if you could comment on what do you think it will take to change incrementalism to a dramatic step change in terms of the way in which government and others are responding to that. Will it take a catastrophe? You could argue we've got a catastrophe now, but what will it take to produce that change?
Can I start with that one? There's probably some people in the room who've heard me say this before, so they'll get tired of it. But I actually think there's a language change. If this was a big infrastructure project, it would be quite different. There would be a big budget to buy 5 submarines or whatever it might take. It would go out to tender, and we'd know that we want this thing, and we're going to get it at the end, and this is what it's going to cost. So I think because it's in this bucket of quasi-environmental law or something, yes, it earns a lot of money, but people haven't connected up this notion that it is, and I don't want to belittle its value by calling it a piece of infrastructure, but if that's what it takes, maybe it's around the language. And my other analogy is you would never start building a bridge without knowing what it's going to take to get to the other side. And we tend to just try and chip away at big conservation and environmental challenges a little by little without really knowing what it's going to take to get to the other side. And so I think some language change and understanding about why it's critical, and this whole conversation about the investment strategy is so important to really understand what it's going to take to get to the other side and be able to commit to that. That's a language change, and it's really understanding that and committing to it.
I think it's sort of part of human psychology that our attention tends to come into focus when there's a sudden catastrophic event, like a terrible fire or a tornado or a hurricane or whatever, and then people focus on natural disasters and the role that climate change may play in them. I think if there is a serious bleaching event on the Barrier Reef in the next few months, and hopefully that won't happen, the proverbial will hit the fan. Already, international media is focusing on the spread of bleaching across the Pacific. So Hawaii is very badly bleached at the moment, and it does appear to be heading our way. Hopefully it won't happen. But I agree with you, it's very incremental, that's what the history says, and often it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I mentioned a couple of steps forward, the rezoning of the reef, the establishment of the marine park in the first place, the ban on capital dredging, but we've had backward steps. We had a 30% reduction in Australia's renewable energy target. We're the only country in the world that had a price on carbon that then scrapped it. So it is very much fuzzy and incremental. I think politicians respond to public pressure. They also respond to international pressure. But the clock is ticking. The global temperature is rising. The Barrier Reef temperature has risen by about 0.7 of a degree centigrade over the last 30 years. And now as we get recurrent El Niños, it's causing bleaching. So we had a major bleaching event in the 98 El Niño and in the 2002 El Niño, and we may well have one in the 2016 El Niño. So as that temperature goes up, we'll see more frequent and more extreme bleaching unless there's some fairly miraculous adaptation by the corals, which doesn't seem likely. So the pressure will build. We're also seeing building pressure in things like recreational fishing. So this last year, the number of licensed recreational vessels in Queensland passed 250,000 for the first time. That's 1 per 19 people in the state. It's growing much faster than the population is. We'll reach 10 million in about 10 million people. But the amount of fishing pressure will double probably in the next 15 to 20 years. So the disparity between the number of fish in green protected zones versus fish blue zones is now about threefold. When it becomes tenfold, it's just going to increase through time. And I think the government will be forced in the not too distant future to consider other ways of dealing with recreational fishing pressure. They may have to rezone the Great Barrier Reef and make more green zones, or they may have to introduce a fishing license for recreational fishers. That's probably politically unthinkable at the moment, but these pressures are building. And if history tells us one thing, it's that governance of the Barrier Reef never stands still, and we will need to respond in the future.
Just a quick response. I think it is public pressure, so I think catastrophes can bring public pressure, but there are other ways of doing it. I'd say the last Queensland election is an example where there was sufficient public pressure that there was some massive changes for governments to say we are no longer going to dump dredge spoil on the reef is a big change. The new pollution targets that came out, the first time targets that are actually intended to be sufficient to deliver the reef the clean water it needs. Those things are really big changes. But the hard part is maintaining that public pressure. So I think right now there's a Queensland task force looking at this very issue, and they're going to have a very tough job devising the solution, but then the government's going to have a tough job implementing it if it is big and bold and brave. And the task force has already said that to get the water quality cuts we need, there's going to need to be transformational change. So I think it really just comes down to communicating with the public and telling them what is going on with the reef so they actually demand government to make these changes.
Thank you for running. I'm Justin Marshall from the University of Queensland, and for this evening I'm representing a citizen science group called Coral Watch, which is very much about communicating to the public. And a very strong message I'm getting from the panel is that we need to communicate to the public. But can I ask the room here, how many public are there? How many people here are not scientists? How many people here are happy to put their hand up and say, I'm still confused, I don't really know what's going on? Or are we all convinced? Are we all convinced that something needs to be done? I think we are. So why are we here? We're not communicating to the public, we're communicating to each other again, which is great. We're defining ideas, we're defining ways forward, we're defining a number of things, but we're still not communicating to the public. So my comment, I guess, would be a very strong comment that all of us, in whatever we're doing, need to focus on that, because to go from incremental to a large change, the public needs to know about the science much better than it does at the moment. They need to be convinced by the science, they need to be not convinced by the, I guess, irresponsible journalism that we're seeing. They need a lot of encouragement from people who are happy to go out there and talk to them, and in particular, not just tell them the problem, but involve them in the problem. So you've got to take people out onto the reef, you've got to take people out onto the water, you've got to take people out onto the farms, the waterways, and say, this is the problem, look at the problem, not just tell them about it. So involving people is, to my mind, a way forward. And I'd like to hear from the panel ideas about how to do that. or feel free to disagree with me also.
Well, just before the panel starts, I'd say that each of our panel does a lot of that, but maybe we'll start with Carol because she does a lot of communicating.
Yes, I probably spend most of my life communicating directly with farmers of one sort or another, and that's the job of all my staff. That's exactly what we're doing day to day, which is trying to translate the science, which is a huge task because there's so much of it going on at any one time. To effectively try and translate that into a useful message that can help people to do whatever they need to do is a huge job. So I guess that's part of our challenge, to keep that going and to be, if I was going to put my hand up to say, to have that funding realised at that local and regional scale so that that work can happen, because it is so critical. So, but it's not an easy job. engaging and building relationships with people is not something that's instant, and it's needs some of that. Someone said to me, you've had 18 months of an extension program, have you met all your goals and reached all your targets, and have we got all that out? And I said, 18 months is nothing. Well, people have only just got to a first name basis by then, so to speak, in terms of the trust that you need to be able to convince people to change something that may well impact on their profitability, their capacity to pay their bills, or to pass the farm on to the next family member that they'd like to. So there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of business, there's a lot of risk-taking involved with undertaking change, and I think that takes a lot of conversations about being able to back and support people to do that, because we all know that in our own everyday lives, change isn't easy on anything. The big obesity crisis, that's so close to most people. If someone says to you, if you don't lose weight, you're going to die, but somehow we still don't manage to get that message across. So you can see that this more circuitous conversation around science and the reef and where you are on top of the catchment is a story that takes a lot longer to tell, and you just have to keep working at it. I think that's a critical thing. The other day I was on a plane, someone asked me what I did, I explained, and they said, I didn't even know you had to fertilise sugarcane. I thought it just grew, and I just thought, goodness me, that's a pretty simple kind of conversation you would have with someone, and yet in the broader community, that basic understanding of systems is just not there. So more power to local staff and organisations to be able to translate the science and have the conversations and build the relationships.
Yeah, I think that one-on-one communication is important. That direct experience of the environmental values is important, but I think mass communication is critical, like getting out into media and social media. So we try and do media to reach a whole array of people who don't get the chance to go out in the reef. We actually get our press clips done, and they sort of measure how many hundreds of thousands of people you actually reached with that. So you're getting onto TV, getting into newspapers, and then building up social media lists. It's quite a new field for a lot of businesses and NGOs, but that's a critical one where you can engage with a range of people and they can also take action and be involved. So I think, communication is critical. I think an audience like this is one form of communicating to people who have a better level of knowledge, but then you've got to get to the people out there who wouldn't come along to a forum like this. So that's a lot of what we do.
Yeah, I agree with everything Justin said. Scientists are generally not very good communicators. We're trained to be nerdy, and we're usually pretty good at being nerdy. People like David Attenborough, who screened a movie at the COP21 meeting in Paris yesterday, or Waleed Ali, who occasionally gives a little diatribe on the Barrier Reef that gets tweeted to 500,000 followers, are much more effective than we are. But as a scientist, I certainly recognize the imperative to communicate our science, and our whole emphasis is in trying to produce the science that supports management, but also communicating that as broadly as we can. So in our centre, we spend about $100,000 a year on media outreach. We have a full-time media person who has a journalism background. We have a website that has about 12 million hits a year. So we do put quite a lot of effort and some dollars into that outreach to the extent that we can afford.
So we're just about out of time. I will just ask each of the panel members to say, what are the 3 things that you would suggest that we need to do to reach the vision of the 2050 plan, which is to improve the Great Barrier Reef. Carol.
Well, I think the title of are we doing enough? I think one of the things we do need to make sure we understand is what is enough. So I think that's an ongoing pursuit of that knowledge. So I think that's always in the forefront of my mind. My top three things are that the solutions for the reef are actually about people. So you can never forget that at the moment. Unfortunately, there's no technological change that can make the differences that we're talking about. It's actually about people. So if we don't remember that, then it's all a folly. I think that from my perspective, working across the whole of the landscape as part of understanding the reef is critical. That I really need to emphasise that notion of it's about the underlying resource for us that is having the impact on the reef and will have impact on other lifestyles. Soil health and catchments is just soil health is my big thing at the moment because it is more than just about the reef. It's just really about where our future lies. And I think it's all about all of us owning that challenge and really, it's unfortunate, or it is fortunate the Prime Minister's banging on about this at the moment, but innovation to me, absolutely, and understanding what it takes to support innovation to get the solutions that we want is something that's not well grasped at the moment, and I think that that needs a lot of support to make sure that that can come to fruition.
I think the government has put out a Reef 2050 plan with these laudable objectives, but they need to back it up with a set of clear actions about how they're going to deliver them, and then back that up with the finance to make sure they happen. So there's sort of the two things in a kind of internal space. But then jumping back, which I think seems to be a common theme tonight, is just that public engagement, public support, public communication, and public pressure, because those actions and investments will only happen if there's sufficient public awareness and desire for them to make the government move.
The 2050 plan focuses on runoff of sediment and nutrients, which is terrific that the state and Commonwealth are getting more organised and more serious about it. They're still pretty short on the dollars to actually implement it. The main weakness of the 2050 plan is it ignores climate change. The development of the Carmichael mine would be a serious threat to the Great Barrier Reef. When I look at the science, we either develop that mine or we protect the Great Barrier Reef, because we can't possibly do both. The emissions from the Carmichael mine would be about the same as New Zealand's. It would increase Australia's by 30% at a time when we're supposed to be cutting it by about that amount. The increased shipping, there'd be about a threefold increase in shipping across the Great Barrier Reef. The impacts of shipping on the reef are not well understood. There's been very little research into it, and the little that has been done has not been generally released to the science community or to the public. But we know there are impacts from shipping of air pollution, noise, coal dust. We know that large ships in shallow water stir up a lot of sediment, and then of course there's the impact of dredging, as well as the removal of the dredge spoil, which now thankfully is onto land. But shipping is not a benign issue. At the moment, about 100 ships are allowed to park their anchor pretty much anywhere within the marine park if they need to. They have particular parking zones near the ports. In the case of some of those ports, there are GPS positions that they have to drop the anchor on to minimise the damage. But for other ports, including Townsville Port, there's just a big parking lot and they can drop their anchor anywhere. So cumulatively, the impact of, say, 80 ships a day, which is the projected number, on the Great Barrier Reef is quite substantive, particularly on nearshore benthic environments, but also things like boat strikes on dugongs, effects of noise on marine mammals. It's not just a benign ship floating on the water, which some people maintain. So to me, we've reached a critical point where the window is closing for what would be one of the world's biggest thermal coal mines as that market dries up. China's already reached peak coal. India has declared that it doesn't want to import any coal. It will develop its own domestic resources. Investment banks are saying they won't lend Adani the money. So in the next few weeks, Minister Hunt will announce his permit for dredging at Abbott Point, probably on something like Christmas Eve. And I think there'll be a public pushback when that happens.
On that note, sad note, I'd like you all to thank our three panellists for a very stimulating discussion.